architect, and a Black woman growing up in the South, coming up in the 30s and 40s, it just wasn't in the cards for her. But she did design the house that I grew up in and that I, as a kid, helped build. So I have really fond memories of my mother doing it. And so I became an architect out of, I guess she kind of bequeathed that love to me. And so out of, in her honor. The other thing that happened to me was that when I was young, civil war broke out in the country where I grew up, and there was this doctor who worked for the Red Cross who went on to start, and he was just really not satisfied, shall we say, with the work of the Red Cross. And this guy actually went on to found the group called Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. And there was a way in which he gave back. And so my parents thought that I was going to become a doctor and do that sort of thing. But I was very squeamish in those days about pain, other people's pain. I couldn't stand it. Now I don't mind so much. I can watch you in pain and go, ha ha. No, I'm just kidding. Um, but I was very squeamish about pain, so I didn't become a doctor. But as I became an architect, I wanted to become an architect who worked for, those typically, not served by our profession. And so that's kind of, I'm sorry, it's a long-winded answer, but those are the main drivers of me becoming an architect.
Mm. Um, so now we're gonna kind of dive into this architecture of play that you picked this topic. Um, so, what does the word play mean in architecture, or to you at least?
Uh, I don't know. I think, so I'm going to tell another quick story. One day, and some of you have heard this, so I apologize. One day, my, um, my wife was out of town and I had to teach, and my son, was sick. So I had to bring him with me to school because I couldn't get out of teaching something. I can't remember what. And so I brought him with me, and we came in and we came around the annex into the courtyard, where that new building is. And he looked around and he said, where's the playground? And I said, we don't have a playground. And he asked, well, where do you have recess? And I said, we don't do recess. And he looked with me with such disdain and disgust and said, what kind of school is this? And this is what led to, this whole argument. And Kelly Hutzel fought for that small little triangle where that wall is built for that reason, because we know, right, that play is the best way to learn. You put a bunch of kids, you just dump them somewhere, right? You just put a bunch of kids like in a space, and they'll make up a game, and they'll like design rules, right? So I think it's like we know it's the best way to learn, and it's fun, and we've done almost everything in our power, like in the name of civilization, to completely eliminate this from our lives.
Mm.
So to me, like play is like one of the most creative things that we do. And since architecture is about creativity, it just seemed obvious to me. I don't know, Katya, you probably have a much more cogent, you can speak to that.
I think you summed it up pretty nicely. I mean, the discourse surrounding play, just like straight up play theory, is people are starting to realize how important it is at all stages of life. It's obviously crucial in childhood development, um, but you never lose the ability to learn. And so, in the same way, you never lose the ability to play. And so, playing becomes it remains super important throughout your entire life because the skills that it builds, like NJ was saying, there's social skills involved, but there's also creativity and health benefits, and those are all things that you can continue to benefit from for your entire adult life. So we need to keep playing.
Um, do you think there's kind of a distinction between seriousness and pragmaticism and playfulness? Like what does it reveal in architecture?
The distinction between what and what?
Um, seriousness or pragmaticism and
Mhm.
playfulness in architecture. Do you think there's kind of enough between them?
I mean, it just seems to me like play is serious. I mean, have you ever seen, like with Green Bay Packer fans or Philadelphia Eagle fans or any self-respecting um, English Premier League super fan? I mean, those people take this stuff very seriously. It is extremely serious. So the idea that there's this dichotomy, I don't get. I mean, if we're going to say that there's something pragmatic about it and this, okay, so then there are several things that we're concerned about, right? Is it safety, right? In other words, safety while we play or safety in life, or don't play around while you're designing something because you won't take safety into account. Like there are all kinds of issues there. Or like is this something you're designing that's supposed to be profound, and therefore we can't play around? It has deep meaning, it's religious or it's political or it's ideological. um I don't know. Again, I will point you to those fans. They're actually pretty dogmatic in their fandom, and which is why fan, the word comes from fanatic. So even play can be extremely serious. So I don't know. I don't get this dichotomy. Now, on the other hand, right, the safety, right? So, the reason why the ARE is difficult, supposedly, is right. I mean, ostensibly, is because if you mess up, somebody could die, right? So it's serious business. But on the other hand, if you don't challenge yourself a lot by playing and engaging in something, a little bit dangerous, then you don't develop the skills to deal with something more dangerous, right? So it's like it's a catch 22, right? The fact that we don't, go out as kids anymore and play in the mud means that we're more susceptible to germs. The fact that we don't run around and scrape our knee, it means that our knees are very weak and soft, and we're all going to be in hovercraft wheelchairs.
Like a Wally.
Anyway, I don't know. Hi, James. Thanks for coming.
Um, do you think architecture itself is intrinsically serious, or is it actually intrinsically playful?
Well, it depends on the architect, right?
Because I guess for context, maybe say for example, Adolf Loos, I believe this is an ornament in crime, says you come along, you're in a forest and you find a field or a clearing in this forest, and you come about a mound, and suddenly you realize that it's a burial ground. Someone is dead there, and all of a sudden you become serious. And he says that's the point where where it becomes architecture. Um, do you
Okay.
agree or disagree with that?
So I will state up front that Adolf Loos was very formative for me as an architect. I believe that Adolf Loos was the most important um, thinker on design. Not that I agree with him,
Hmm.
but that polemical that he wrote about ornament and crime has affected almost everything that we come into contact with. I mean, my contention is that it's because of him that iPhones are so smooth and lacking in any detailing, any distraction, right? So he won. But was he right?
Mm,
I don't know. I mean, you could make that argument and you could pick that, right? It's the same way. In other words, he in his case, right, he's made a good lawyer's case. But the thing he forgets is that you could look at another example not far from there, right? Say among the Aztecs, where you find, they actually have played their games and they played with the ball on the places where people were buried, right?
mhm,
So I can, sure, he can point to that example and make his case very, very well. But, I can point to the other one and you can say, well, the Aztecs built much more involved architecture than those burial mounds,
mm.
right? And then you might say, well, then I will show you a cathedral. And then I will show you the entire, what is that thing called in St. Louis? Where that guy, do you remember what it's called, Katya?
It's just the Museum of Play.
That's it. Well, which takes over like a good chunk of the city of St. Louis, like down of like a section of the city. So like I don't know. I mean, Six Flags is a. So think about it. Like if we destroy our civilization, which is not out of the realms of possibility, and an alien life form sent an anthropologist, and they saw Vegas, they might think that was the greatest achievement. If they saw Six Flags, they might think that was the height of our civilization. How would you tell? So
Mm.
I mean, I'm not saying Uncle Adolf was wrong. I'm just saying, like, man, I don't know. No, with all due respect to Uncle Adolf, I don't know. That's all I'm gonna say.
Okay. I think we're gonna shift to something more towards the current, not the 20th century. Um, how do you think, uh, how has COVID-19 changed how we play? Uh, or do you think COVID-19 has changed how we play?
Well, I have no idea, right? Because like probably half the children are not in school anymore, which would have been the number one place they would have been playing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, it has affected our politics such that even funny things are not funny anymore. Um, you'll have to excuse me. It used to be that when I would go vote, I told my wife I vote based on which candidate I thought was funnier, and my wife thought this was terrible. Wait, so now I just vote for who she tells me to vote for. But if she doesn't, then I have to go and read policy statements and all this stuff. So anyway, so the fact is, right, it's made our politics much more serious, right? Um, as if it wasn't, lacking in humor already, right? Um, and you might think I'm making this up, but the politics in this country and in other countries have always been serious, but at the same time people had tended to have a sense of humor about things. And my worry is that the sense of humor is, it's not so much that it's more serious now than it has been, which I've heard other people say. I don't know about that, but I do know that a lot of people are lacking in a sense of humor, and that worries me. So there's that. And then there's obviously the human contact, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it may be that we have to come up with new games, right? And it's something that we, I should say, as designers should all be thinking about. So for instance, in my studio right now, in my studio, we're working on the side of a mountain. It's a village literally on the side of the mountain. And one student wants to put a soccer pitch in there. And so you have to start talking there. Well, you're never going to get, 50 feet or whatever it is wide space to put in a soccer pitch. And so maybe you redefine the game. And he stared at me and I thought, well, racquetball is exactly the same game as tennis, only you're playing it up against the wall. It's the same kind of thing that it's not so much that the game changes all that much. It's just that the platform and maybe some of the rules change. But the things that you enjoy during doing while doing those things, maybe those things remain. And that's what we can do as designers. And then the idea of like, So I think that you guys going through this are going to come out, in most cases, obviously not all, but in most cases, much more resilient and much more improvisational and perhaps more creative than others, because you had to deal with this kind of crisis situation, because it forces you. And so that's what I think is like, when you are challenged in this way with something like COVID, that's what happens with that. I don't know, Katya, what you think? Thoughts?
I think you covered a lot of ground.
James, you here? James is playful.
Hi, NJ.
You,
Uh, I unmute myself. Sorry, I was mute before. Hi,
that's
long time
okay.
no see. Good to see you.
Good to be seen. Better than being viewed.
You like to play with words. I love.
I'm sorry I was kind of long-winded. Did I answer your question, Matt?
Yes, I think you asked our question. I think I might follow up with uh, since I mean you have mentioned that like we're becoming resilient, but I think that's always been kind of in our education to find a problem and solve it. Um, though I think this is just another form of
That's disputed. There are a lot of people who think that architecture is, the purpose of architecture is not to solve problems, but I just wanted to put. I'm not. I don't hold that view, but I just wanted to add that.
hmm, I think this is kind of another version, like almost like another iteration of how do we solve this problem? Do you think in this kind of digital age we'll start to be seeing some kind of more like finding different ways of interacting with one another that aren't kind of uh, that don't require people to be put together in the same room or the same place? Uh,
Right. Yeah, sorry. That's actually the part of the question that I had wanted to answer, that I lost my train of thought. Yeah. So what's going to happen is, right, that uh, as I was saying, this whole idea of improvising, in a given context, that's part of the context now, that the things that we thought were our notions of intimacy, right, are now called into question. Um, what's supposed to be acceptable, and Angelica can speak to this much better than me, and Jenna, and he's not here, Jack. But because they did the research on this, we know, right, that in different cultures, right, there's an acceptable, it's called proxemics. You guys know what this is? The study of like an acceptable distance between me and the person next to me, whether, depending on how close I am to that person. Like, obviously, like if it's my wife or my family member, really close, total stranger, you stay over there. But then my wife is from West Texas, where, her family's closest neighbor, her parents' closest neighbor is like a mile away. And my people, my father is from, southeastern Nigeria, where your closest neighbor, you can hear them in the kitchen, right? So my notions of what's sort of acceptable and hers are different. And so when I go to West Texas, I'm feeling like there is nobody here. And when she comes to Nigeria, she's like, like,
Claustrophobic.
okay, too close, too close, too close. Because that's what you're kind of used to. And then to have COVID throw this, all of this up, gets upended.
Mhm.
So it's like everything that we do, right? Almost everything we do depends on that idea of that distance between people. Um, we measure. So, for instance, I just taught this again in the summer, right? Sizing for the numbers of bathrooms. Well, the code, right? Certain, it says for certain types of occupancies, I can have this much load, and it's determined by a certain density. And so I make these decisions based on that. Like almost everything in the architecture, right, is dependent on that. So the structure of the building, right? If I can I can build a warehouse, But if it's a warehouse, the structure is different than if that warehouse is a nightclub,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because if it's a warehouse, I got one or two people in there. If it's a nightclub, I have 1,000 people in there. So even the structure is different. The fire safety issues are different. The number of plumbing fixtures, stairwells. You know what I mean? So it completely reorganizes all of that. And I haven't read up on this, right, to actually adjust. And we don't have a new code come out, right? So it has to be completely rewritten. And that's assuming, right? And the reason it hasn't been done is because the assumption is that COVID, we don't know how long COVID is going to be with us. So maybe if it goes away, then we don't have to worry about that. Or if we get a vaccine, maybe we don't have to worry about it. Or maybe if everybody vaccinates, I mean, getting the vaccine is one thing, and then getting everybody to vaccinate is another, right? So those are the things so everything changes, and then it changes our notion of like what's playful.
Mm-hmm. Do
You
you
know,
think?
like I can't walk up to you now like I used to do and poke you on your shoulder and say, and then when you look up from your desk, I say, get back to work. I can't do that anymore, right? So like, and Sean knows because I've done this to him multiple times, right? So I can't do that anymore. So it's like I have to think of some other way to do that, right? So it's like everything we do gets sort of rethought.
Mm-hmm. Do you think? Um, I mean, earlier in the pandemic, I think a lot of news sources and kind of journals, newspapers, etc., started to get like op-eds or editorials from architects saying like, how is this going to change our environment, our built environment? Um, do you think we are actually going to be changing a lot in our environment or designing just better spaces? For example, like the need for outdoor classrooms or something. Is that actually something that's happening in the time of COVID, or just kind of some cultural shift in like our idealized learning model?
Well, I mean, it's not the first time architecture has had to sort of adjust. If you look at, and here it was, I thought that by picking play, we wouldn't delve into these very annoying, serious topics plaguing us in the world. But
We
we
can
are in a
shift.
plague, so we must talk about the plague.
We
Um,
can move away from the plague. Next
no,
question.
no, no, it's okay. It's okay. I don't mind. There's a, there's a whole, and recently I had to lecture on natural ventilation. So I ended up completely rethinking my lecture and talking about the time when there was a huge tuberculosis pandemic. And the classic example that the one of many examples I could have used, but the one example I did use was the Alvar Aalto's Paimio Sanatorium.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a building that basically was done in response to that. Um, and what's really funny, maybe not funny, haha, is how, because, and this was prior to sort of mass adoption of air conditioning, right? So the fact that we have now sort of uh, uh, um, what's the word I'm looking for? Adapted to the idea of air conditioning everywhere all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
The idea that we would design a building that would just sort of be naturally ventilated isn't often considered, right? And it's not that people haven't thought about it. It's like it's hard for people to think about it. But when we do as designers think about it, there are impediments in our way, right? So there are financial interests in what the dean of the UPenn Architecture School calls the Comfort Industrial Complex, which just cracks me up to no uncertain end. I was in a conference and he said it, and I was the only one laughing because there weren't a lot of sort of environmental control lecturers in the room, just me and him. So I was laughing. So anyway, so because of that, right? So there's that problem. But then, there's a way in which the equipment in hospitals, right, has been designed, right, with the assumption that it's going to be at 70 degrees and 50% humidity, right? And so like the idea that you're going to open a window is just like anathema. So it's going to change. How it will change, I have no idea. And, you know, something like that specifically is probably going to happen in Massachusetts because there's a huge sort of medical equipment industry here, or the exact opposite for the same reason, right? Because of the Comfort Industrial Project complex, or it will happen somewhere like California, which always sort of, not always, but often is in front of these things and thinking about, okay, you know, and also because it's easier for much of California because they don't have the extremes in weather.
Hmm.
But it will change. How it will change, I have no idea. And it may be too late.
mm. um, if you'd like, we can shift gears in our
In
conversation.
fact, one could say it's already too late because 250,000 people have died in this country, perhaps needlessly.
Mm.
Almost a quarter million. Yes.
Uh, if you'd like to move to a different kind of
No, no, I
subset
don't
of
mind. I
questions.
didn't know how this was going to be. So I had all these videos I was going to show. I was going to have Katya show her, talk about her thesis and then leave questions. But this is better. I just make up stuff.
Put you on the spot.
I don't mind.
Well, if you would like to show videos and images and pictures, you have sharing capabilities.
Yeah.
Yep. Uh, we really wanted to make this like as informal as possible, even though I ended up becoming a moderator. But
Ah,
I think we should open this conversation up to everyone else if other people have questions. I'm
very
getting
good.
tired of hearing myself asking questions. Um, you can either type them in the chat box or you can unmute yourself. Everyone has that capability. So without further ado, everyone else.
I guess I'll continue the conversation from like not sophomore, junior spring, when I already bombarded you with all these questions, NJ, and made Jebediah do a bunch of activities. But where do you think that the line between childhood play and adulthood play kind of starts to cross over?
I'm going to let Katya answer that one because she might know it. I don't know.
I think that's sort of based on your perception. At least my argument in my thesis is that there should be no line. There's different types of play and different ways that you can play, but I don't think there should be a line, I think is my answer. I think that, you start to change the way that you're going to play, but like we never stop using our imagination, for example. You maybe shift the way that you're using it. And you maybe stop imagining that you're a pirate or there's sea creatures or whatever, but you can still imagine new scenarios, imagine different situations, different conversations with people. And especially as designers, we're imagining things every day. And so if you start to look at that as a form of play and rather than just like your work, it can become more enjoyable and more productive and more creative. So yeah, I think it just changes, but I don't think there's really like a hard line.
You mean I'm not a pirate?
I mean, you could be. We don't know.
Well, yes, I guess that would be part of me being a pirate, not letting you know. Ha ha. So I think the idea that it would depend on the person is very germane, right? And then your approach. There's a great quote I found about from the philosopher John Seeley Brown about how the difference between imagination and creativity, right? And like creativity is taking something, what is it? I can't remember now. See, that's what happens as you get old. You start to forget things. I have to look it up. Questions while I look this up.
There's a question in the chat, and it says, how can we challenge social norms to combat adult repetition in everyday life so that it can feel like play?
What do you mean adult repetition?
Jenna?
Like there's an assumption in the you know in the question, right, that a repetition is adult and play doesn't involve repetition. You know what I mean?
I kind of want to maybe add to that question, because I think that for adults, there's a stigma that you should be more mature, and that play becomes less of a acceptable. It becomes less acceptable as you get older. So I think maybe that's where the question might be
I get
kind of
that.
referring
And
to.
yeah, it's a good point, and I get that, and that's sort of the thing that I'm questioning. That that's actually you challenge. I guess my response was that the way to challenge it is to challenge the premise, like because there's an assumption that it's widely accepted that what it means to be adult is, you know, to be a serious, and stop playing around and get a real job. Like what the hell does that mean? I'll give you another really good example. A few years ago, I was listening to the radio, and this woman had written a book, and they were interviewing her. And she was talking about how she had interviewed children, you know, across the world, and she compared sort of children on two extremes of time spent with parents. And there was this uh, ethnic group of people who live in the Amazon in Ecuador somewhere. And they asked the children, how many hours of the day do you spend with your parents? And they didn't understand the question because they spent every hour, waking hour and sleeping hour with their parents, because, that's just, life with them in their community. It made sense, right? So they didn't even understand the question. And then the other end of the spectrum was some extremely wealthy kid in Malibu somewhere. I don't know where, a rich community in California, Southern California, but I think I remember Malibu, but maybe it was somewhere else. And they asked this young lady when was the last time she had seen her parents, and she had to check her phone because didn't remember, right? So, like who is better off, so, like whose idea of what it means to be a serious adult is the better one, like. So I think we have to sort of challenge that. Now, I'm not saying we should live the way that group of people lived in the forest. I'm just saying that the ideals that we have placed for ourselves in modern society, I think we should question that, and not necessarily accept everything that it, all the implications, logical or otherwise, that it foretells.
I think you can also sort of start by expanding your definition of play. Um, like hanging out with your friends can be a form of play if you're joking and kind of, making stuff up and playing around with each other. That totally counts. Playing card games, board games, video games, whatever, that counts. Daydreaming can count too. So I think if you start taking steps to like kind of realize how much play you are doing but aren't thinking about, it can help reframe the way that you're looking at it. And if you start to like become more aware, then you can kind of build upon that skill and get better at it. But it's also like, it's fine to recognize that you don't have to be playing 24/7. Like, we're not saying that you can't be a serious adult. I mean, I think I kind of agree with NJ that they don't necessarily exist as opposites of each other, but there's a time and a place, which is fair. So small steps first, and I think also just like care less about what other people think.
As also playing music. What is the
Yeah.
opposite of play? That's a very good question. Um, it's certainly not work, right? Um,
Boredom.
yeah, I think um, the opposite of play is probably boredom. I don't know. I think so. You know how some of our closest genetic relatives groom themselves? You know, like you get a bunch of chimps or bonobos together, and you know what the thing they do to build their social bonding is grooming. So the idea is the similarity in human beings is actually gossip. Like that's the equivalent. It's not all the other things that we think. And so this theory is that language was developed so we could gossip, because gossip is the human beings equivalent for what, when other primates groom themselves. So it's a way of social bonding. And so when I get together and I'm telling stories, that involves a lot of play. It's just that play then engages in physical activity, and there's a lot of learning involved. And I think part of it too is like when we say, so harking back to your earlier question about seriousness, do you know what the definition of learning is? Like the real definition of learning? Anyone? See, we all assume it has something to do with like sitting in classroom and facing forward. And we know, like in our gut, that that's just not true, right? The real definition of learning is that when something happens such that your brain physically changes, that's the definition of learning. In other words, your brain has picked up something and realized that this is something that should happen again, could happen again, might happen again, and it's adjusted to anticipate it, to either enjoy it, to deal with it in some way. That's the definition of learning. And play is one of the things, more than almost anything else combined, creates that, because it engages everything in the human, like everything the human being can do, like language, socialization, social structures making, physical and mental activity and building. And then there's the exterior, right? I mean, what could be more playful than, stacking blocks, i.e., architecture? Throwing a rope across a ravine, i.e., a bridge, that you could swing across. Like there is nothing about like what we really do as human beings that isn't intrinsically playful. I argue.
Oh, we have a. Do we have another question? Uh, does play happen when engineering ends and architecture starts? That's one of the questions.
So as an engineer, I will take exception to that. So I was trained as an engineer before. So I've put the videos that I was going to show you in the chat, so for you to enjoy at your leisure. Watch them in sequence, because it's cool like that. And the first one, no, not the first one. I think the second one is my favorite ad of all time. So is play happen in, is play the transition between engineering and architecture? Maybe, in much the same way plumbing is the transition between sculpture and architecture. But you see that's a kind of an insult right there. So like I could insult the engineer by saying, play is the transition between engineering and architecture. But you could also insult the architect by saying, plumbing is the transition between architecture and sculpture. So there's a truth in it. It's just that I think I wouldn't say that because I think it diminishes, the one side of that coin.
We have another question. Uh, Considering that the notion of play varies based on cultural and social norms, in terms of Western society, where play is assumed to be childish, do you have any advice on how we can reinterpret play that is more acceptable for adults?
Well, I mean, there's a development of sort of this whole maker culture, which is a great development. I mean, the downside of is that there's a lot of plastic being produced in the process, which is unfortunate, right? Because not to bring up COVID again, but the problem with COVID was, right, encroaching on habitat. When you encroach on habitat, you get zoonosis, right? The vector jumps into from one animal to another, and then our response is more plastic, which is more encroaching on habitat. So, but that said, just like in any endeavor, right, you could find less harmful ways of doing that, right? So, some of you may be in Rob's studio and you see his efforts, many efforts over several semesters trying to 3D print in clay, and Rachel, who was supposed to join us, the other uh, person I invited was, playing around with biomaterials, right? And some of you know Orion, who also played around with biomaterials. So I think there's that, right? So, like anything we do, right, we have to consider the various ways in which we can do it better. But there's this notion that there's a maker culture, and there are various ways, at least I think of that having come out, because there's a way in which in Western society there was a shift towards specialization, right? Um, I think Thomas Jefferson once wrote that every man, and one would argue every person, should be able to chop down a tree, build his own house, maintain it, all these things. So there are all these skills that every one of us would have had in a less specialized society that's sort of gone away. Like an architect 20, 30, sorry, 200 years ago would have actually understood how to build in their context, right? That many of us don't know now. And in fact, this gets compounded by COVID because, you know, you don't get to go to the shop and make stuff, right? But towards that end, I would encourage you to just make stuff. The best model I have seen, and she's not here, so I'm not going to, embarrass her. But apologies to all of you because you have all made amazing models that I have seen. But the best model I've seen probably in the last 10 years was a student. Oh, hi, Jillian and Andres. In Jillian and Andres's class, she's a current junior. And over the summer, she made this model. And at first, I had no idea what it was. And because she's showing it on the screen. And then I look at it and I realized she made them out of gummy bears. And just the way the light came through. Oh, yeah, Sophie, you know who I'm talking about, right? The way the light came through this, I was just so mesmerized. And I said so, and she didn't believe me because she thought like she had done something out of desperation. But yes, there was desperation there, but there was a playfulness, right, in the way it was made. So I think that also sort of just experimenting, and you know, um, even in your more serious endeavors, serious classes or serious projects, figuring out a way to sort of playfully experiment is one of the ways in which you can sort of save yourself from the doldrums. um and also like learning a different skill. Yeah. So um, if say if say you wanted to understand how sound waves work, um, it's hard. It may be hard to do, but I know a guy who set up lights that were activated by sound, right? Because you can have a sound sensor, and so and I was looking for this video. He had this great video, and what you'd see is like he set up these posts, at night out in the field at certain distances, and then he'd make a sound, and you just see the lights come on, go down the line. Or you could do it with water because it's also waves, right? So that kind of cross pollination of ideas, you know, um, is the kind of thing that if we had like a big wide open lab, we could do. So I'm going to sort of bring you guys into my political movement for a more fun architecture school. Um, and so if you watch the last video of the ones I said, I think that was the TED talk about. Some of you may know this Japanese school that's sort of a circle around a tree, and the kids they just run. They run, on average 4,000 meters a day, and they just keep running, and there's noise, and like the teachers don't say, "Well, be quiet, sit for," because what has being quiet have to do with learning? Absolutely nothing. So my idea of an architecture design program is that you have this big wide open space where everybody is in there exchanging their COVID breath. Okay, maybe not. Hopefully, COVID is gone. Hopefully, there's no COVID. But it's big, wide open, and just people walking around just making stuff. Whether they're 3D printers or whatever, there are different things, and it's like people are like erecting things, and things are falling, and it's like it falls down, and you say, okay, I won't do that again. Not safe. There's that experiment about where you have to make a tower with spaghetti and what is it, marshmallows, something else, maybe tape. So when I taught the junior studio, that would have been that was my first assignment. I'd say, okay, make it, groups of 3, make a tower, and they have to agree, right? So there's that, like consensus building. What could be more important for a politician than consensus building, right? Uh, Teamwork. What could be better in any circumstance where you're working with people than teamwork? There's a way in which we teach in architecture as if you're all going to go out and be sculptors, like living out in the middle of nowhere. But we should probably teach more that like they teach in theater, right? Where there's a gaffer and there's someone who has to organize the lighting, someone who writes the thing, and then there are actors who play. So everybody, and that's how you usually, and I, you guys have all probably done a co-op, so you know what I'm talking about.
Mm.
Like
NJ,
this one person. Yes.
sorry.
Yes.
So if the school allow professors to rate grade people by their failures instead of their success, would you agree?
Oh. So the more failures you have, yeah, that's fascinating. Well, I mean, I will have to give this much thought because I like that. There's a book by the philosopher, what's his name? German philosopher, Popper, Karl Popper, called "Learning from Failure," and he would support this idea. Uh, yeah, I think it's good. I mean, my own grading philosophy is you start with an A, and you do the work, you get the grade, and if you don't do the work, you just you lose the grade based on not doing the work assigned to that amount of points. Because I'm not really interested in the grade. I'm more interested in that you actually learn something and you enjoy yourself and you gain some meaningful, uh, meaningful interactions. And I unfortunately I can't, put a CAT scan and measure your brain and see that synapses have developed and it has changed. That would be the way to grade, right? Because then I'd know, yeah, okay, she learned something. I can see this network here that wasn't there before. And the reason I can isolate that it was the effect of this class is because we have a control. We have a bonobo in the next room who did not participate in the class. I don't know. But the school has a completely different policy on grading, unfortunately, which is okay, I suppose. I don't know if I've told you guys. I'm sorry. I guess we're running out of time. But a quick story. The first time I found out about the school's policy, I went and complained to the dean. And so I complained for like probably a half hour. It was probably 5 minutes, but it felt like a half hour. And God bless him, Chuck. He listened to me very quietly and very patiently. And then he just said to me, but this is the grading policy at every university in the country. And I said, really? I had no idea. So I was like, okay, tucked my tail between my legs. I went back to work. Anyway, good questions.
See, thanks.
All right.
Does anybody else have any final comments or questions? Going once.
Sarah, you want to go?
I was just gonna ask if Katya had her thesis ready to show us, if maybe we could have a quick little like peek at what you did, because I'm really curious to see what you looked into.
Sure. I have a couple of slides of work that I did. I can sort of fly through it just kind of quickly so that I don't take up too much more of your time. All right. Can everybody see?
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is sort of a selection of works that I did as part of my thesis in 2018, as NJ mentioned. It was titled In Search of Play, and I worked to create a new architectural narrative for Boston. So I'll skip through the background stuff because I think we've kind of covered a lot of it through the questions that we were discussing before. But I established, for the sake of this thesis, 5 different types of play: physical, tangible, narrative, social, and imaginative play. And as I'm sure everybody is already kind of well aware, like over time, we start to play less and less. Children are innately good at playing, but we sort of forget how to do that. So I did a series of explorations to create this new architecture narrative for the city. And I came to a number of conclusions. And the first is that play is public. Here are some examples of play within the city of Boston that you're probably already familiar with. We have public parks and sort of like organized activities and some installations in public art. And these are all fantastic ways to bring play into the city. However, they're not really approaching like architecture and the sort of built environment just yet. And so the next thing that I learned was that play is a process. I went through a bunch of precedents and organized them based on their intended user and the space type and how many people were there or were supposed to be there, and then started creating architectural objects that sort of fit those same categories and manipulated them based on different user group types and the expected number of users. The next thing that I learned was that play is very personal. So the sort of guiding move throughout my entire thesis was that I created a series of spatial moments in section that are architectural translations of different types of play. And so the spaces that I created are supposed to encourage at least one type of play but are not prescriptive necessarily about what type of play can occur there or who can play. And so this diagram is just explaining that the same space can, regardless of what I intended it to be used for, can be used for any of the types of play by anyone. And going along with that, play is for everyone. And so as I was creating this series of playful moments, I wanted to keep in mind all age groups and all ability types and make sure that there was at least something for everyone. And basically what I started to do was I drew all these sketches and I cut them up and literally started to play with them and aggregate them in different ways and start to put them together in something that sort of becomes a building. And I was working with these types of play that are embodied in these sectional moments as a method for exploring the potential for play within architecture. So play is also everywhere. I developed those playful moments that I showed earlier a little bit further, and instead of just categorizing them based on the type of play that I was intending, I began to also look at where within architecture these moments could occur. So there's some for interior spaces, some for horizontal moves, some for vertical moves, some for circulation to get you from one place to another, and some that are enclosure and actually part of the building's skin. And so the idea with this sort of series of playful moments is that you could integrate them into any building type and any program type in any arrangement and any quantity. So you can start to add them and start to pick and choose based on the program and your user type and potentially add over time. And so this is a couple more examples of series of buildings that I started to intervene and add these playful moments throughout these sections. And so the last conclusion that I came to is that play is discovery. When I started my thesis, I sort of initially thought that I was going to be producing a building. And some of these sections that I'm showing now are while I was still under that sort of notion. And I created these playing with the sectional moments where I selected some that I had established, connected them, and turned them into a building that provides a diverse options for play. And they're all kind of packed here together and connected. And so there's some other spaces that can be used for different program types. So there's the two different examples of that. However, as I was going through this process, I discovered that this thesis would probably actually be more effective if it was broken up across the city instead of packed into one location. So instead, what I proposed was a series of installations that would be scattered across Boston, where a few of the moments from my kit parts were selected and connected to each other. And then I dissolved their boundaries and worked them into a site. And so here's an example of one of those interventions. This particular one was for physical play. So I have just a couple of them here, and then you can kind of see the process as they were connected and worked into a site and then opened up to become more public and more inviting. And so the goal of these interventions is to present these opportunities for individuals to play while maintaining the personal choice for how you want to play and if you want to play by yourself or with other people, and also maintaining public access. And so in conclusion, my idea is that the playful aggregation of moments of play within the city creates an environment in which everyone feels encouraged to play, and users are welcome to interpret and adopt the space to meet their needs, and all can reap the benefits of playing. And that's a really quick, condensed overview of my thesis.
Do you guys have questions for her? Otherwise, I can show some quick pictures of an office building that integrates playfulness in it. But I'll wait if you guys have questions for Katya. One new question. Okay. Let me see if I can figure out how to do this again. So the only reason I'm starting this in this really awkward photo is because it's the first photo apparently that I took inside this building for some reason. So you see, it's like a basic office building, but you see this part here. You know, they have this little foosball table, but above it is this wooden thing, and then that's looking into it. You see, there's a glass, like a window looking up into it. And so then, you know, you go up, you have a courtyard. It's really nice. Nice details. Okay. Anyway, we go upstairs into that, you know, so most of it is like a regular office building, but this is inside the space above that sort of glass window. And, you know, here are full grown people. Once they're in this space, they started to play around, right? You know, you could climb up. And then they had these other sort of interesting moments between the levels, so that even the parts that didn't necessarily have to do with the fact that they had this open space, which is kind of over here, meant that it interacted with the building in certain ways that were unusual, shall we say, that you wouldn't normally find. So this is me standing on that glass window. Yes. And then they had another space on another, I want to say, I think it was on the same level, but sort of in another wing, which had this sort of Zeppelin embedded in this sort of rammed earth piece. And this is the inside of the rammed earth piece. And it has all these bottles that allow light in. So it had this kind of effect with the glass and the bottles. And this is how it's sort of right, basically embedded in, you know, a pretty typical office building. And because I'm an architect, you know, I want to do detail shots. Anyway, so, you know, this is, I think, looking, you know, past the rammed earth piece to the Zeppelin piece, which is suspended from the ceiling.
NJ, there is cool. There's a person asking the name of the building.
You're muted.
You muted.
About that. Sorry about that. I don't know why I started playing music, but that was googly for you. That's an interesting thing about like AI. So AI anticipates things based on like what you have done, and Google anticipated that I would like this music, which makes absolutely no sense to me. Like I get a lot of ads for, you know, extremely right-wing political stuff, which also makes no sense to me, but that's how they have read me, which maybe is a good thing that they have misread me, so they don't know me. I don't know.
NJ.
Sorry about the noise. I can't remember the name of the building. It's I'll find it and I'll send it to you guys. Sorry.
I have a last thing I want to say to you, that remember once in Chicago we were traveling with WAC.
Yes.
You say you gave a prep talk to everybody before we go out the hostel, and then you say, remember, pay close attention to buildings, but remember buildings that would kill people, not physically, but the building that kills souls.
Yeah. Yeah, that's you know, that's a thing that we don't get to talk about a lot. But I think that, you know, that all that weird stuff that you learn in your first year that often doesn't make sense to you, that's what that's all trying to get at. And I'm not I don't know whether it's successful or not, in part because, at that stage, maybe, it's a little too up here for you. But by the time you get to your thesis, I think you get it, because then you sort of it's the time when you have an opportunity to like take a really challenging, interesting idea and play with it, and I mean playing with it seriously, right? Like playing with it in a way that's fun, and in a way that's experimental and challenges your preconceptions and all of those things. But um yeah, there is nothing more soul deadening than, you know like a lost opportunity to inspire. And there's a comedian. There was a comedian named Lenny Bruce. He was really famous in the early 60s, actually into the 70s, but really famous in the early 60s. And he in his earlier years as a comedian, he would rail against the Catholic Church and say, how come the Catholic Church, and it was basically all institutions, but the Catholic Church specifically, in his jokes about how come they have these really expensive and cathedrals, and that it's really often poor people, right, that they are collecting money from to build these poor people who live in rat and roach infested garrets. And he talked about, for a good chunk of his career, how that he felt that was wrong. And that's true, right? There's a certain in certain quarters, and not just, again, the Catholic Church, but any large institution that takes advantage of the little guy, right? A little person. And that's not good. But as he grew older, he said that, you know, while he still doesn't let them off the hook, he understands why those cathedrals have to be so glorious, because it gives them something, while they're working in their, whatever miserable job, and they have to go back to their roach and rat infested garret, that going into this sort of inspiring place gives them something to aspire to. It gives meaning to their lives. So thanks for reminding me of that, James. And when we kick this pandemic, I want to see you guys out there in that play space. Because if it's too crowded, we may be able to get a bigger play space.
I agree with that. I think we should all take more time out of our days to find some playful activity or change our philosophy on what we do every day and make it more fun. Um, if anyone has any more questions, or if anyone doesn't have any more questions, I think this was a very fruitful and very fun conversation with you, NJ and Katya. Thank you both for coming to our conversation. Make sure to check us out in 2 weeks when we talk with someone special. We're gonna keep that secret for now. You guys will have to guess who it is to entice you guys to come. But
tell your friends.
Yes, tell your friends to come. Everyone, check out the website. We'll be posting some really interesting stuff for people either to read, peruse, look at, listen to. We're really trying to create kind of a place for community and discourse within the kind of the school and the department that we see as kind of lacking right now in this current time because we're not able to meet physically. So please check us out. Keep us or stay updated on our Instagram. Constantly look at our website, bookmark it, put it on your reading list. Never take it off your browser. Does anyone have any final comments?
NJ, can you bring Troy next time?
Hi,
I
Emily.
miss being in tech.
Hi, Emily. I was with Troy all day. No, that's a good point. But you assume there's going to be a next time. After my major fumbles today, these guys are not going to want me back.
No, we'd love to have you back.
Oh, we love you.
I think Troy is probably going to be on one of these. I don't know. Let's
He
hope.
could be. He could be.
Let's hope
Stay
so.
tuned.
Yeah,
I'm going to
stay
try and
tuned.
make it to all of them.
How about trombone?
Uh,
Trombone.
I don't know.
You'll have to stay
All right,
tuned.
I have to go and get on a Zoom call for the local permitting board. I go to these things as part of my, you know, my understanding of how, so I get to become a better teacher. So I go and listen to technical review board meetings. And now I can do them from the comfort of my home. There is nothing more boring. It's more boring than watching paint dry. More boring than watching grass grow. I have lots of these. I could just keep going. Anyway, ciao. Thank you,
you, Andre.
Katya.
Thank
Bye,
you,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank
Take
you,
care,
Katya.
James.
Yeah.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Take care, NJ. Thanks for monitoring. Like great